Hello, I'm Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. My thanks to Aaron Stein and the listeners of Chain Reaction for this opportunity to present a new series of 3 episodes on global migration. In September 2014, I arrived at the Budapest airport in Hungary. It was my first time in the beautiful country, and I jumped a taxi to the hotel in the city center. My driver for the trip, a Hungarian man, roughly my age, began the standard foreign traveler casual conversation. "Where are you from?" he asked. And I followed with the standard, "Are you from Budapest?" pronouncing characteristically wrong the name of the city, emphasizing the rodent-like spelling of pest rather than the actual transliteration of Budapest. On the way to the city's amazing downtown, I saw people carrying bags walking along the edge of the highway. I inquired, pointing out the window, "Syrian refugees?" He glanced toward the side of the road and then shifted his gaze toward me in the rearview mirror. "Yes," he said. I said, "Wow, I researched this, but it's the first time I've seen this in real life." My driver responded in a curt fashion, "Yes, get rid of them, kill them." The rest of the drive proceeded in an awkward silence. I was unsure how to follow up to his retort. Over the next 3 years, the Syrian migrant crisis continued, and the surge of refugees into European countries pushed the Union to the brink. Some countries, like Germany, accepted many refugees whose assimilation into society inspired a right-wing counter-movement. Other countries, like France and Belgium, simultaneously confronted the challenge of accepting Syrian refugees while suffering terrorist attacks from returning ISIS fighters. And just 3 years later, I returned to a very different Hungary in 2017, where the society had undergone a noticeable shift as their president, Viktor Orbán, used refugees as a political weapon to harness his own power and usher in a far-right era of nationalism that continues today. Today, I'm chatting with Jessica Bither. Jessica is a senior expert on migration based in Berlin, Germany, where she looks at the intersections of migration and technology. Jessica, what first got you interested in migration?
I think there are 2 things. One is sort of my personal history, which is that I'm a German American and grew up in both Germany and the United States. And then, of course, growing up in Germany, I always had a very keen sense of history and displacement and the way the two tie together. On the foreign policy or international relations angle, I always thought that given migration and the way we manage it, is so central to the way the world is organized into nation states that how could it not be a foreign policy issue if we're talking about the changes the way the world is ordered?
So that's excellent because the U.S., we used to call ourselves a nation of immigrants because we are, for the most part, aside from some Native Americans that were there long ago. And then separately, if you fast forward to more recent times, what we've been focused on a lot is migration into Germany, where you're at. It's been a huge issue. So what does it feel like being in 2 different continents, in 2 different countries, one that calls itself a nation of immigrants, one that's taken in a lot of immigrants? What are the dynamics at play, and how does it just feel similar but maybe different?
I would say 2 things. The first is what you mentioned, is that, of course, the United States has traditionally always defined itself as a nation of immigrants, but also is seen like the role model of that in the world. Versus Germany has actually, far before 2015, already been a country of immigration. But Germany had been much more reluctant to come to terms with that. And so what you're now seeing over the course of the last, I would say 5 years, if not 10 years, is almost sort of a shift in the sense that the discourse in the United States has become much more centered around maybe we are not or do not want to be a nation of immigrants. Whereas in Germany, you're seeing the opposite of a society coming to terms with actually being an immigration society.
So it was about 7 years ago for me. I was in Budapest, Hungary, and that's when I first saw the Syrian refugee issue firsthand. And I had read a lot about it, but I hadn't seen it up close and personal. I understand this largely shaped a lot of the dynamics we see in Europe around about 2015 with the Syrian refugee crisis. Can you talk some about what that was like from a European perspective in terms of seeing migrants come in, really refugees from these conflict zones? What were the ramifications that played out in Europe and in Germany in particular?
Just to maybe give it some context of what has actually changed, because of course we all saw the pictures in the media of what in 2015 really was a changing moment for Europe. And these are important to understand sort of how the political climate has changed, but also to understand how European member states and EU member states are acting right now.
How does the interplay of one essentially affect the outcome, not only of that, first sort of wave, right, around 2014, 15, but what you're seeing now in terms of the issues and the buildup around Belarus?
Well, I think in a way the situation is very different. The first situation that's very different is the way the European member states are reacting. And this is, you have a political and a humanitarian crisis in Belarus right now, but it's not a migration crisis. First off, the numbers aren't comparable. You have a few thousand people. It's not any comparison in terms of the numbers, where over 1 million people at the height of the refugee crisis were coming into Europe, but where also there was no border controls over the Western Balkans that have been set up since then. And also there was much more disagreement between the different EU member states of how to deal with it. And that's why Angela Merkel's decision of the German government at the time to say, we will let people coming from Hungary, and remember back then it was a political crisis also manufactured by Viktor Orban, who was driving migrants to the Hungarian border to move onwards. Now, what you're seeing in the east right now at the Polish-Belarusian border is very different. So first off, the way Poland reacted is, in a sense, very extreme. What you're seeing is that, of course, the Polish government that's run by the Nationalist Law and Justice Party took it for their own internal purposes. They declared a state of emergency. They've issued a new law allowing for pushbacks, which is a clear violation of European law, and created a special zone where they're not letting anyone into it to talk to migrants or to see what's actually happening. So no media or humanitarian organizations are allowed. Now, the difference is that the European member states have been largely silent on this issue. So they haven't really condemned Poland on these actions, even though, as I said, it's a clear violation of European asylum law. And in fact, just 2 days ago, the European Commission announced that it would make an exception and temporary measures for 6 months on the border to Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, where it would basically allow for the temporary suspensions of rights granted usually under asylum law. So the ability to detain people longer at the border in temporary reception centers, longer processing times, etc. This really epitomizes what has changed since then. So the European Commission backing a Polish government action that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago.
So it's fascinating. You mentioned a couple times there, Jessica, that it was manufactured, right? The entire idea of the crisis is manufactured. And whether it's Viktor Orban a few years back or Alexander Lukashenko with Belarus, do you really see migrants as a sort of weapon to be used politically now? And do you fear this approach will be used repetitively across Europe?
Yes, I mean, in a way it is sort of emblematic of what has been happening more and more overall, right? So Alexander Lukashenko is just continuing what has become much more of a political trend, though more blatantly than other countries. But we've had the disputes in Turkey, where early 2020, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, said, okay, I will no longer stop people at the border, leading to a mass border crisis between Greece and Turkey. On the one hand, it is a bigger issue. On the other hand, what you're seeing in this particular case is that it's actually not really worked for Lukashenko's advantage, right? There's been much more resolve and unity among the European response. And in return, what has actually happened is that there's been such an amount of sanctions that the numbers of migrants are actually not escalating, and it's not really brought him what he set out to do. So basically what you're seeing there is also the limits of these threats that might have a short-term political gain, but when countries and others and international diplomacy rally together, it isn't clear that it could be used in the same way.
Right. And so that's a fascinating point that you make. It's not always used the same way. And this really stuck out in the Washington Post. I believe you wrote an op-ed, which was talking about the role of migrants essentially inside democracies once they immigrate, if I understood it correctly. It almost looked like they could be weaponized by foreign autocrats in a different way. So you outlined, in the article how Turkish immigrants into Germany are changing domestic politics. And essentially the Christian Democrats who were led by Merkel allowed many of them to arrive in the country and maybe ushered waves of immigrants in. And yet these very immigrants that maybe came in under some of those policies of the Christian Democrats and Merkel may ultimately succumb politically in a way. Can you explain that sort of dynamic and phenomenon, really what it says about the European Union and democracies and how this immigration situation will play moving forward?
The article I wrote was before the last German elections where the Christian
Sure.
Democrats won. I was referring to Germany's long-standing immigrant population, of which one of the largest groups has been Turkish, either Turkish descendants, first, second, or third generation. But these are
Right.
really groups that have been in Germany for a long time. And I just mentioned that because some people conflate all immigration as though it all came to Germany after 2015, which of course is not the
Right.
case. But you of course mentioned a bigger issue, and that's been a case in Germany, and especially when it's come to some segments of the Turkish population here, or Turkish descendants, not most of them, but where President Erdogan of Turkey has actually held political rallies here in Germany, because these are people who are able to vote in Turkey if they're not German citizens. And so that has basically been an outside influence of potentially stoking tensions within German society, but especially between maybe members of the Turkish society as well. I think is something that comes with any immigration society where you have a significant amount of different migrant populations who have maybe come more recently, who still have ties to their homeland. And to a different degree, these diaspora ties can play out either in politics in their home country or in politics or in tensions either between and among certain groups or between different groups in society.
So, from your perspective, you worked at the German Marshall Fund, a lot of EU involvement in and through that foundation and just across the board. Over the last 20 years, most of my encounters with European governments have been through some sort of nexus with immigration, either historically or more recent. So, as you look through it through a lens from the European perspective, what's your takeaway of these different countries, how they handle immigration? Do you see policies or procedures or ways to think about immigration moving forward at a time when we've got climate change, for example, which will send populations moving in all sorts of directions, predominantly to the north or to the south and away from the equator? Are there takeaways that you've seen from Europe of countries that have handled it better that can maybe guide others as we will likely see more of this in the future?
Well, I think there, Clint, it's really important to distinguish between three different levels of how we look at it. The first one, and that's what you maybe were referring to, is sort of immigration to individual European countries with all the different histories. And there, I think it's so important to keep the local context in mind. And it's very difficult to just compare what's happening in France to what's happening in the UK, to Sweden, to Germany, just very simply in terms of integration. If we're talking about that, that's something that we really need to go on the individual country level. Now, the second and the third one, and this is what I have been typically working on, is what is happening in terms of migration management overall. And the sort of the second level is the European level, which came out of the Schengen area, the free movement area of the European Union. And this is the reason why European countries have tried to and had to work together in managing migration, in trying to cooperate more between countries. And this is why, of course, the external borders of the European Union have become so important. It's in order to uphold this free movement within Europe that basically doesn't have any permanent border controls anymore. And then there's the third one, and I think that's perhaps the most relevant to your question when it comes also to the climate change and different movement and displacement that we might see there. That is really the external dimension of migration management. So how do European countries as the European Union, but also as an individual states when it comes to issues such as return or working on different aspects of legal migration, of asylum resettlement with different countries together, that is something that we're seeing that's being developed or that also needs the most work. How do we actually establish a more sustainable migration diplomacy to work towards human mobility between two continents or three continents going forward in a much bigger pictures of better combining our foreign policy objectives, right? How can we think foreign policy, migration policy, and development policy together much more strategically in order to be better prepared, but also better to manage human mobility, migration, displacement going forward.
So that really leads me to what is, I think, a lot of your work that's super fascinating to me, which is the intersections of migration and technology. So what are some of the major technological developments that are having the greatest impact on migration, both in terms of policy, the phenomenon, and security measures?
Excellent question, Clint. And of course, you mentioned a very important sort of contextual change that's related to the use of technology and social media, and that's the whole new information disinformation ecosystem that just wasn't there before, maybe 10, 12 years ago. And that has changed the speed with which people move, the way they coordinate among each other, but also the information they get and why they set out to do what they do. So that's sort of the context in which that happens, and that's super important. What I've been looking at mostly in my work is which types of technologies are actually being used or tested at which points and in which different settings of migration management. For example, the increased collection of biometric data in order to cross borders. So biometric data that is increasingly collected and stored, that may be automated at border kiosks, but it's also increasingly used in visa processes or can be activated somewhere else. You have different complex algorithmic decision-making systems that are being tested, for example, in visa processes by countries like Canada, but also the European Union is planning to use this in asylum application hearings, where it's used as speech recognition technology or in order to analyze situations. And then finally is the registration identity management of refugees and refugee settings. It was piloted by the UNHCR, but you have different areas where this has really proliferated in that area as well in the humanitarian setting. Perhaps just those examples of the breadth of which they're being actually already employed.
So that brings up an interesting comparison, Jessica, that I was just thinking through, which is, as you know, here in the U.S., our past president's solution to all immigration issues was to build a giant wall. Meanwhile, the Europeans have taken a much more technology approach. But there's lots of ethical considerations to that and in terms of increase in technology. And then I wonder about the effectiveness. Could you maybe talk to both? Which is more effective or more humane is another way to sort of think about it. And what are the upsides and downsides ethically in terms of using these technologies?
I would start just by saying that often these technologies, they're presented in a way that promises to be more efficient and that there's somehow this magic neutral tool that we can use. And I think it's really important to note that these tools are just never neutral, and you really have to look at the specific use case. And then one important thing is to really look at the context of that we're dealing with, and this is migration, human mobility, and refugees. And this is an area where people often are already in really vulnerable situations. Often they have no choice or little choice in any decisions they make. Say, if you need to register your biometric fingerprints to get food, is that really informed consent? And then also, if you think of things of, being allowed to travel or enter a country for visa or for work purposes, there's always this power imbalance, and there's a high discretion on behalf of individual states and case officers. Now, that per se isn't bad, because this is the way our world is structured, that states can decide also for security purpose who they let in and who they don't. But it's really important when looking at the use of these technologies that this is the context that we're dealing with. There's maybe just a couple of very concrete ethical or really human rights concerns that have emerged in this area where we actually see the real risks of employing the technologies, the increased collection and registration of biometric data, sometimes iris scans, etc., in either refugee setting or displacement settings. And a recent example that emerged that really shows that risk was that in Afghanistan, where there was news reports that perhaps the biometric data collected by the US forces on assistants and helpers in Afghanistan fell into the hands of the Taliban. So the basic issues of data security and data privacy, how do we ensure that the data collected stays in the right hands and doesn't pose any additional risks to the individuals? And then you have the issue just related maybe to algorithmic models in general, algorithms making decisions about our credit scores or in recruitment, but take visa processes. If governments use only past data to determine who is most likely maybe to get a visa or who's considered most secure or wantable to get a visa. But these past decisions, were biased or were utterly dependent on certain biases of the case officers in a certain country. Then the danger is that we just reproduce these biases on sort of this global scale on who gets to move where. So these are maybe just some of the concrete risks that we can look on.
So we've focused a lot on the sort of security, monitoring, tracking part and how states are using technology. But as you mentioned kind of when we started the conversation, there's lots of opportunities with emergent technology. What are some of the advantages that are maybe given to them that wouldn't even be imaginable maybe 10 years ago? But there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation ploys going on now, which are disadvantages. So wondering from the opposite perspective what you thought.
I think there it's really important to, as I said, to just really look at the technology and the context. And I think there are use cases that are really not as controversial or actually non-controversial. You can think of chatbots that really provide information much faster. You could think of very simple sorting mechanisms that help speed up administrative processes or actually allocate resources where they're needed. There's a lot of work being done with different forecasting models that basically draw a huge amount of data that could actually help for states to better prepare, allocate resources for when it's expected that more and more people will come to a certain setting. And then on an individual level, there is a lot of opportunity. What we see already in a lot of refugee settings is that just access to bank and cash transfers via different money payment options on your cell phone has actually allowed many more people to be financially independent, to be much more flexible in what they do, to even start businesses. So there is definitely advantages to that. But again, it's not one rosy picture, but really needs to be looked at carefully and in context.
Jessica, just in conclusion, what are we missing in terms of the immigration situation, how it interlocks with technology? What isn't being said? What is not commonly known about this? There's so many dynamics to these situations. What doesn't get enough attention in mainstream media and sort of international affairs?
I would say, and just having looked at this technology, is that a lot of it is being sort of tested and tried in these individual cases that I mentioned, but it's either not put together in one place or people are unaware it's being done sometimes in secret by government. But to really look at it from a bigger picture about how will these technologies actually then change the way we may manage human mobility going forward. And that, of course, ties back to the bigger geopolitical pictures in terms of, are we using technology for surveillance purposes? Will that be a requirement to move across borders going forward? Or are we actually creating a world where technology is being used to improve different things?
That was Jessica Bither, senior expert on migration. In our next episode, in this special chain reaction series on migration and security, I'll talk to Ian Urbino, director and founder of the Outlaw Ocean Project, and a journalist who recently reported on the human rights abuses occurring in migrant detention camps in Libya. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Kurzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. You can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.